because as soon as it's green, no one asks any questions. There's almost endless support from the state and celebrities and influencers and politicians. And when it goes bad, I haven't seen a single person come before the courts. I've never seen anyone go to jail. I've never seen anyone fired. It's almost like the Vasa. You remember the Vasa ship, which was also a great fraud and a great disaster, but no one was beheaded. So is the green transition just Swedens green Vasa?
Hej och välkomna till Folkets Radio. Idag med Alexander Pohl, entreprenör och miljöaktivist. Välkommen.
Tack.
Or should I say welcome? You are originally from Germany. You grew up in the US. So we have decided to do this interview in English. We're going to talk about wind turbines and how they affect surrounding nature. And this is a continuation of a series of interviews about the so-called green transition, den gröna omställningen, which critics say is not actually green at all, but a way to make enormous profits. So, Alexander, great to have you with us. Tell us a bit about your background and how your love for nature, for pristine nature, actually brought you to Sweden.
Thanks, Per. It's a privilege to be on the show and to be able to speak to your listeners and watchers. This topic is very close to my heart. The last 5 years I've lived in Sweden and have had all manner of adventures and challenges. So hopefully my story will inspire others as well as to raise awareness about the dark side. I call it the darker shade of green that we are seeing be rolled out throughout Sweden and other countries. I love nature. I grew up very close to nature. I grew up in the US in a small farming town. My parents were very hands-on parents, so we did lots of things in the garden. We sailed on holidays, always using the elements and nature as sort of the basis of growing up. It was just pretty normal. I then left the US and moved to Europe, did my schooling, but nature was always in the background. I always loved being outside. I felt quite at home in the forest, and my feeling was that I needed to do something with my career that somehow benefited nature. So when I went to university, I studied environmental engineering, and I was going to build infrastructure and things that would solve the world's environmental problems. Then I started at KPMG, and even though I started as a generalist, a trainee, just doing auditing, accounting, etc., I quickly found my way into a nature-themed or sustainability-themed career path. So nature had always been there in various shapes and forms. I got swept up by the the Grundomställning, as it was back then. Climate change, sustainability was in its early days. It was very profitable. So we did lots of spectacular deals and projects and financings when I was at HSBC, the bank. And I felt that money and nature could be best friends. And if you made nature financially relevant, then maybe that would unlock the tsunami of work and projects and interest that was needed, because it doesn't take a genius to see how much waste and destruction is happening around the world. I mean, you even walk through Stockholm and there's, rubbish on the streets, a lot of noise, construction sites, etc., all very unnatural things. So there's a lot of unnatural to be undone. That then led me into the bank doing fascinating things, as said, working with big companies like H&M, Shell, Unilever, big energy companies, looking at making them more sustainable. And then one day I just started having burnout. I started having moral and ethical dilemmas at work. And I went on a 9-week trip with my family to the US, national parks, a lot of nature. I came back, and then I just thought, okay, I need to find a place that in 20 years, if the world continues on this terrible path, we would be safe. And my kids would say, Papa, this was an amazing thing that you did. There is still nature here. We can still live here. It's still safe here. And that led me to Sweden. As soon as I landed on Sweden, after doing a big analysis of the world, I thought, wow, that's the most logical place to go if you're a nature loving, decent human being. Because, of course, all Swedish people and the country of Sweden itself markets itself to the entire world as the pinnacle of nature loving, humanitarian, people loving countries of the world. So it was almost a no-brainer once I came onto Sweden that this was the place that a nature lover like myself and my family could go to find nature and live more closely to it. Of course, technology helped. I didn't speak Swedish. My Swedish is getting much better now, but using Google Translate, I could simultaneously translate Hemnet and buy a house off the internet for 10,000 euros. That house happened to be in a little forest village, a little skogsbyn called Bojavatnet, which I didn't know at the time, turns out to be quite a famous tourist destination because it has a haunted house, the Spukprästgården, that many people have visited in their journeys into Norrland. And it was perfect. I'm surrounded by forests. I'm sitting in my house at the moment, looking out the window. I just see the autumn colors, birds. It's a very nature-based place. And so I thought I had found perfection. That was how I got to Sweden.
Yes. So you were in the banking, industry, and you were on this green bandwagon. You really believed in this technology and wind turbines, and then something changed your mind. Take us through your journey.
So, I mean, maybe it's good. I'm just going to share my screen for just a second. So this is a picture of Bojavatnet in the summer. This village used to have 300 people. It was a thriving community based on forestry, based on farming, based on nature. Very, very beautiful place. Nearby is the Amaron River. It's Natura 2000, one of the best fly fishing rivers in the world. You don't see any wind turbines. I do work in the winter with the elements. You've got frozen lakes, cold, a very perfect nature-based place. Ragunda Kommun, which is the commune that I live in, is one of the poorest in Sweden, but it also everywhere on its website. Every time you speak to a politician, they talk about the power of the forests, the power of nature. So it was very important that I reconnect with this. And then I do lots of kind of crazy things. But then something started to go wrong. And this is an image of David and Goliath. And this is sort of the basis of where I felt that my work that I had done, where we were looking at building utility scale wind farms or solar parks, looking at very large electric car charging infrastructure, things started to feel weird. So I felt a little bit like David because I started asking questions of this big green horde that said, don't ask any questions. As long as it's green, it's okay. And that was a real challenge for me. When I then started to come to Sweden, that really started to accelerate things. So I came to Sweden 2019. In February, we bought the house. In October of 2019, there were no wind turbines to be seen anywhere. There were some that were present, but I couldn't see them. I didn't come across them. No one spoke about them. October 2019, I heard about a meeting, and that was my first entry point into the strangeness of wind power. Live in the middle of the forest, natural place. Everyone loves nature. There is no wind. So wind turbines. You know, logically, you would think it would be in a windy place. There is hardly any wind here. It's actually classed a low wind area. But suddenly there was a meeting for some wind turbines to be built. And I looked into it, and nothing that I found using my banking, I'm an engineer by background, using just simple common sense and logic, nothing about the wind farm made sense. And then Google was buying the electricity from the wind farm. The investor who was building the wind farm was a Luxembourg-based investment fund. So very dodgy. Anything that comes out of Luxembourg is usually tax avoiding or dark money. And then it was the wind turbines were being built by a company called General Electric, one of the biggest, meanest corporate companies in the world. So it was a very strange configuration. And then when I started asking questions, I didn't get any straight answers. You know, it was very evasive, just very strange. And then I looked at the documents, and it was clear that the documentation was fraudulent and that they had lied and cheated. But when I took that to the Landstyrelsen, when I took it to the courts, I always was denied access or thrown out due to technicalities. So that then gave me further confidence and concern that there was something very strange going on with this industry, because the Landstyrelsen said, well, once we issue a permit, we don't care if the documentation was fraudulent or not. A permit is a permit. And I thought, well, that's the only country in the world that I've ever heard that if you obtain something by fraud, you get to keep it.
So, Alexander, we're going to come back to this topic of the corruption of this and the fraudulent arrangements. But if you perhaps just can begin by also, telling us a bit more, how does this affect the surrounding nature? How did this affect the place where you live?
So I've been working a lot with paradoxes, and the paradox that wind is particularly representative of is, does it make sense to destroy nature in the name of saving it, right? Because nature is alive. It's a living ecosystem. The climate is not alive. So the climate is not alive. It's just like a physics class. But nature is alive. It has plants, animals, humans, etc. So it was really fascinating for me to see how devastating these wind farms are. I live in the forests here. Of course, much of Sweden is plantation forestry, so the forests are not there as good as they were originally. But there are naturreservats, there are biotoper, there are all kinds of sensitive and very important nature things around here. So it doesn't make sense to take an industrial complex, which a wind farm is an industrial complex. It's machines, it's noise, it's heavy, it's destructive, and put it straight in the middle of nature. So just let me share the screen again. And so here you can see, this is from Björkvatnet wind farm, one of the largest cranes in the world starting to construct the tower sections of a wind turbine. The forests are about 30, maybe 40 meters tall, the tallest trees. And these turbines tower above them about 250 to 300 meters to the tip of the blades. So they are very, very heavy and present within the forests. So they lord over the forest, so to speak. And then this is Björkvatnet Wind Park. I mean, it's OX2. OX2 was just bought by a very large Swedish private equity house called EQT, which is the investment vehicle of the Wallenberg family. They were building 30 of these massive turbines across the forests. And then you start to see, so this is the wind park just across the road. It's called Högsjön. It's run by Jämtkraft and Persson Invest. And you can start to see this used to all be trees. And now you can see the waste in the background, the widening of the roads. Here you can see I'm driving through one of the wind farms. This used to all be forest. Now you can see the scale of one of the wind turbine sites. Again, this was all forest. It's peat, so it's svampskog. So not it's basically peat, and peat is a very important material. Particularly if you cared about climate, you would not disrupt and destroy peat. It's not very good for SCA, which is the forestry company, because peat forests don't produce as much timber. Here again, you can see this is one of the foundations, the pit that they carve out into the middle of the forest. It's the scale of this is unfathomable. And of course, once it's built, everything that's under the ground is just left after the wind farm supposedly is decommissioned after 25 years. But everyone knows that these wind farms, they don't last 25 years. We have trucks coming through all the time with spare parts, materials. It's a bit of a lie. And of course, these wind turbines are not indestructible. So at Björkvatnet, they've already had 2 turbines have blades explode. So if we're talking about concerns about microplastics and pollution of natural areas, wind turbines often have pollution. And, this is a great example of big pollution. But of course, they also have noise and sound pollution. So I really asked myself, does this make sense? Because it is so destructive. And actually, if you think about the situation that we're in, a wind farm only produces its nameplate electricity for about, I don't know, 10 or 20% of the time. The rest of the time, it's producing a relatively unpredictable amount of electricity. So you need to keep building almost infinite wind farms to meet the almost infinite growth in demand for electricity. So what's happening here in Björkvatnet and here in Jämtland, eventually, if the world continues the way that it is, we will need wind turbines everywhere because you need electricity and it needs to be there. And what people don't realize is that there are all manner of poorly studied impacts from wind farms. This is just a very good illustration. This is an offshore wind farm showing the vortex. So this is wind. So of course the turbines catch wind, but behind a turbine, they create all types of turbulence. These are, again, things that are not being studied. They are not being considered. And the wind turbines are essentially a paradox because they take energy from the climate, because wind is part of the climate, and they turn it into electricity. And when you turn wind into electricity, you have less wind. So you are disrupting the climate by having wind turbines. And people might say, oh, it's just 1 or 2. But we are now talking about tens of thousands, if not soon hundreds of thousands of wind turbines that are getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. So the scale of destruction is a total paradox. And I am very frustrated when I speak to Naturskyddsföreningen, Greenpeace, WWF, all of these, the Miljöpartiet here in Sweden, all of these nature-loving entities and institutions, and they are promoting these destructive solutions. It just doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah. So, with the amount of money in this is almost also unfathomable in this green transition. When we spoke over the phone, you were telling me about the corruption, and it's also huge in terms of politics, local decision-making, science, bureaucracy. And this is a huge topic. We could discuss it probably for hours. But could you perhaps just summarize the most important aspects as you see it of this corruption?
Yes. So, many people look at wind as a savior. It's wind. If we build enough wind turbines, climate change won't happen, and everyone will be able to live their lives as they see fit. But the problem is that these wind turbines are not. They're not actually really profitable, so to speak. So, if you're very smart, you develop a wind farm and then you sell it to someone. and then they build it, and then they sell it to someone. So usually the person who develops it makes a lot of money. The person who builds it usually makes a lot of money. And then the person who owns it over a long period of time eventually will lose a lot of money unless they mess with the markets and electricity prices keep going up, which could be. Usually the people who develop and build are private equity, basically elite investors. And then the assets get sold to something like AP1, AP2, like a pension fund, because they're supposedly safe. So you have a lot of people making money up front. They have no issues bribing people. They have no issues putting a lot of pressure on people. They have no issues lying. And we are seeing that because the courts are in bed with the Landstyrelsen. Often the companies who are involved in building and developing are owned or controlled by influential individuals. So you see a lot of nepotism and a lot of overlapping. So, for example, EcoGain is one of the leading consultancies in Sweden for producing corrupt environmental reports. So they're supposed to go in the forest and identify birds and kungulon, golden eagles and things that will potentially be destroyed by the wind farm. But of course, they have a vested interest because they're paid by the developer to not find anything. Because of course, if they find something, then the wind farm can't be built. Johan Kunestina, I completely destroyed his surname, used to be the chairman of the Klimatpolitiska områd, so the climate policy committee of the government, advising the government on climate. Well, he also sat on the board of EcoGain. Mm-hmm. So he had, he was a corrupt individual. And of course, now he sits on the board of not RISE, but it's the Swedish government grant agency that gives grants to academia. The name has just slipped me. So again, he has gone to another role where he can influence policy. And we see that everywhere. You see people who are from Energimyndigheten, which is the energy agency, suddenly becoming they're part of the milieu, the environmental courts. Mm-hmm. So these people are all biased and they are jäved, as it is, but no one calls them out. They don't. If you try to call them out, your claims are just refused by the agencies, because in Sweden there are many agencies where there's an ombud where you could take a complaint, but you just receive a decline. We will not accept your complaints. So to see this time and time again shows me that there is a systematic corruption. I even spoke to Ulrik Ashud, who is the chairman of Transparency International Sweden, and he seems to suggest that Sweden is so pure and uncorrupt. But time and time again, the developers, they come and have the meetings in the little villages with the villagers, and they lie. They set up a bygdepeng, so they set up these community funds, which are voluntary, and they allow money to be spent on completely frivolous and unchecked projects. So we've probably had over 10 million kroners spent in the local area, and it's just been squandered and wasted. I even uncovered an example where they were going to use a community fund, which is supposed to help the local communities, to build a new bridge for a wind farm so that they could move their heavy machinery in and not have to pay for the new bridge. So there is endless examples of lack of governance, bribery, fraudulent claims. The newspaper, we have a newspaper called Jämtlands Tidning. It's one of the local newspapers. It only prints pro-wind articles, because it's funded by, it also produces the wind power sector industry magazine. So every door I open is a conflict of interest, nepotism, or some other form of corruption. And that really shocked me. In Sweden, of all countries.
And also, I've heard that when these big companies are building a wind farm, so they make a claim on the amount of noise that is going to make, which is very important for the ecosystems. And then usually this is not true, that the noise is actually much louder than what they claim, but that nothing then changes. Is that true?
That is 100% true. Most of the sound studies in Sweden have been produced by a company called Acoustic Consult, and Acoustic Consult uses a generic model. So they don't actually use the exact conditions that would produce the worst noise. It's almost like an average summer's day, and that is. Well, I mean, models are used all over the place, to make claims that then are not true. But again, because the Länsstyrelsen just says, I need a noise study, they just produce one, and then no one checks. And then if someone complains, the company itself will do a noise monitoring using usually Acoustic Consult, right, to say the noise is okay. So it is so fraudulent. And actually, Sherston Persson Wayne from Gothenburg University was one of the first people to start to investigate and make the link between wind turbine noise and sickness. So she was doing REM sleep, that wind turbines affect REM sleep. Then you have Anna Skarin, who's at SLU, the university, and she's researching the impacts of wind turbines on reindeer. So we have a number of people just starting, but of course they're poorly funded, right? Mm-hmm. They're always put under immense pressure. Sometimes they are gaslit. Everyone who challenges wind power by saying, it's destroying nature, it doesn't make sense, is suddenly branded right wing, which is hilarious because if you are a tree hugger, I thought you were left wing. But now, so that's another paradox that suddenly right wingers are tree huggers and the left wingers are, are for the machines. I hope that answers the question. It's just, I always have to laugh because it's just so much and so deep.
Yeah, it surely does answer the question. And it also, this is probably the biggest bonanza in history in terms of making money. I heard the chairman of BlackRock, the world's biggest investment company, they were estimating something like $50 trillion of profits, and investment possibilities. So it's almost unfathomable, but it also creates, of course, a whole new class of careerists. Anybody who's willing to go along with a narrative can make a career within bureaucracy, in schools, universities, science, business, what have you. So I guess this is also one of the reasons why it's so difficult to challenge this machine, which has so much power behind it.
It is very much an indoctrination. So I don't necessarily condemn those who are careerists, because I genuinely think that many of them don't realize the truth. So I went to a Klimatseminariat in Östersund, which is my local, the I guess you'd say the main center of Jämtland. And this was the seminariat attended by several hundred people from the commune, from the Länsstyrelsen, etc. And they were basically bombarded with propaganda for an entire day. So if you have enough propaganda, you start to believe the propaganda. And I have some children. They are in the Swedish school system, and in the Swedish school system, they are also subjected to pro-machine, pro-wind, pro-green transition propaganda. And it's and of course, academia. We have a number of people who are funded very well by Energiemyndigheten, by the Wallenberg Stiftelsen, etc., who are all pro-machine, pro-climate industry. And of course, you are right. And Sweden is one of the most indebted countries in the world. So everyone has a big fat mortgage So they are not free and independent. So they will tend to prostitute themselves, so to speak, to do things that they may not 100% believe in because they need the money. And that's a very smart tool of control by the government, because the government is driving this agenda. We can have a big debate about who sits behind the government and influences the government, but it's very clear that it is systematic. And just look at Northvolt, okay? Northvolt has I don't know, it's probably had 5 billion of investment from different places, pension funds, some industrial sources, etc. That money has been spent. So, it's gone into people's pockets, but now suddenly Northvolt is almost bankrupt. So I always also say, well, let's look where the money went, because that's usually a good indication of who's involved in the fraud and who is going to lose, because ultimately there are always winners and losers. And within this space, the losers are usually average citizen, so taxpayers, lots of taxpayer money, lots of state staatsbedrag and things like that get wasted. It's pension funds, so people's future is being burned. I mean, just look at AP. I don't know, was it AP5, which invested in Silicon Valley Bank 6 months before it went bankrupt, and they lost 1.13 billion kroners. We're going to see this time and time again. People's futures, their hard-earned money that they put aside for retirement, being burned on corrupt and pointless green projects. Because as soon as it's green, no one asks any questions. There's almost endless support from the state and celebrities and influencers and politicians. And when it goes bad, I haven't seen a single person come before the courts. I've never seen anyone go to jail. I've never seen anyone fired. It's almost like the Vasa. You remember the Vasa ship, which was also a great fraud and a great disaster, but no one was beheaded. So is the green transition just Sweden's green Vasa?
It's a very good question. And it also raises the question, in terms of democracy, how much really possibility of influencing this local politics, for instance, or local decision making, does people have in Sweden to actually decide what happens to their land?
So it's a very, very good question, because Sweden does pride itself on being a very democratic state, a very role model, fair society. Everything is rättvist, etc. However, when it comes to this wind, and it's only going to get worse because they're going to remove legislative barriers, the average citizen has little or no legal power to fight wind farms. If you have a Föreningen, so a legal avatar, Föreningens have more power. The commune, which has the commune veto, has more power yet. However, it all relies upon the Landstyrelsen and the courts. Of course, the Landstyrelsen and the courts work for the state. They do not work for the citizens. So unless you have a very, very clear and very almost cut and dry case, you're often just going to be either thrown out or ignored. Or the trick that I saw is they let you win in the lower courts, but then in the highest court, in the Supreme Court, you lose. Because if you lose in the Supreme Court, you can never challenge it again. It's a done deal. So there are also lots of games where they let people win a little bit, or maybe they let them win against a wind farm that was never really going to be built anyway, so that they can lose against the wind farm that will be built. So there's a lot of games and politics, political games behind the scenes that people have to fight through. I always say it's better to try and fail than fail to try. I mean, I have spent 50,000 euros of my own money so I had one of the best lawyers in all of Sweden helping me. And I've gone to court or challenged in the administrative courts 15 permits. I lost every single time. But losing all of those times and wasting, I didn't really waste it, but spending all of that money enabled me to prove that there was a fraud and a systematic collusion, aka conspiracy. So I was able to evidence base my thoughts and my opinions rather than just, doing some internet research or, watching some YouTube videos. I proved this fraud in real life through the courts, through going to different forums. I mean, let me just give you an example. Can I just share my screen again for a second?
Sure.
So local people are trying to fight these wind farms. This is an example. People living in Fusjön and Björkvatnet are trying to fight Jämtkraft, which is a commune. It's a Jämtland commune-owned energy company, and Persson Invest. And Persson Invest is owned by Bob Persson. He is one of the elite families in Sweden who can be connected to Greta Thunberg. And there's a great article. I encourage, maybe I'll send it to you and you can share it with your viewers, that shows the link between Greta Thunberg and rich industrial families in Sweden. But people try to stand up against it. So they then go, and this is a photo of some of the locals who are motivated to fight the wind farm. These are the just normal average people with normal average jobs trying to defend themselves. The wind farm was built, by the way. I then went to try to meet some of the actual young activists. This is Skogsupproret. It's a forest activist organization, very radical. They chain themselves to trees. They set up these camps to fight logging. I drove 13 hours in the middle of winter to join one of their activist training camps. Speaking to them, they didn't have a clue about wind power. They thought renewable energy and the green transition was good. And then I even went as far as to make a movie, right? Because I felt I was unable to communicate this fraud and the technical issues, because most people fighting wind farms are not a banker engineer with 20 years experience. They're a normal person who maybe works in the local library or is a retired pensioner who has no technical or financial background to be able to fight these things. And they then get stuck with their entire life at risk. Once these wind farms are built near your home, it almost becomes unlivable. And then, they lose hope. There's a lot of people losing hope at the moment, but I say it's better to fight or defend. I need to change my language. I don't fight, I defend. I stand up for what I believe in. I stand up for my rights. I stand up for myself, and I stand up for nature.
Yeah. I don't know. I just sort of, when you speak about this, I sort of associate this famous novel by George Orwell, 1984, War is Peace, Freedom is Slavery, where actually when you really want to do something bad, you claim to do the opposite. So, I mean, I think most people, I hope at least, feel a sense of awe and reverence in the presence of nature. And the whole wind movement is sort of promising to save nature. So what you're basically saying is that this is actually a fraudulent promise at its core. It's actually destroying nature. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. Yeah. And I mean, it's a tactic that gets used time and time again. I mean, when we were preparing for this chat, we talked about Homoslur, the chemical from the 70s. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, there was a representative of the forestry industry on national television, I believe it was SVT, so the national broadcaster, proclaiming that this chemical is 100% safe, and he drank a glass of it.
För att illustrera de krav som ställts på företaget lät direktör Foss blanda samman så mycket fenoxisyra som man under loppet av 50 år har tillstånd att släppa ut från BT Kemi.
Nu tar jag dette glas och kommer cirka halvdelen i dette glas svarende til 25 års udslæb og drikker det.
But of course, he was drinking a glass of water because it was super toxic and very polluting. So Sweden has time and time again been subjected to this type of psychological tactics and propaganda. And the wind power sector, I mean, it's the same thing with kalhugga, forestry. Many people don't realize, that the forestry industry in Sweden is a very toxic and a very environmentally destructive industry, which the wind power industry could easily piggyback. SCA, Sveaskog, Norrskog, all of these, is it Holmen? All of these mega forestry companies already influence the local politics. They're the main employer. They're the ones who are paying taxes. So they have very strong influence. And the wind power industry has simply piggybacked a lot of this corruption that already exists in Sweden's forestry industry. Because again, as I learned, Sweden is not the fourth least corrupt country in the world. It is arguably the fourth most perfectly corrupt countries in the world. And I see it just with regards to how these companies, so it's almost fascism, the companies are in bed with the government. If you speak out against the government, you are gaslit, or if you speak out against the companies, you're undermined or gaslit. The newspapers are all propaganda tools because they're owned by the same people who are best friends with the forestry industry and the people in the government. So it's a very fascinating time. I mean, most people will not have heard of me because all the press in Sweden, except for one person, Stefan Lindberg, who wrote one article about that included me in Aftonbladet like 4 years ago, not a single word is printed about me. Even my film flatlined at 230,000 views on Google because it's being controlled. So why am I so dangerous with my message of truth around corruption that I'm silenced? So that's why I was so pleased that I came to your attention, because the more we document these examples of fraud and corruption, the more evidence people will get to understand that we're not conspiracy theorists. We're not making this stuff up. It is Orwell's 1984, fact and truth being lived in Sweden.
And I think also perhaps the most important thing is also to say that you're not actually fighting this fight because you don't care about nature. You're doing it because you love nature and you want to be on the side of nature. So wrapping up, Alexander, this is such a mega machine. It has all the muscles. It has the media, the money, the politicians. How do you see a sort of a culture of resistance taking form?
Good question. So let me just share my screen again. Like I said, I made this film, and I highly recommend your viewers take a look. Take a note if any of the views numbers change, because it won't, because it's Google is implicated, and Google, of course, is the host on YouTube. But I just say that the only way we're going to get resistance is by people taking spontaneous action and actually acting in the real world. So this was SVT Möts. So I snuck onto the set of an SVT live TV show to ask a very difficult question about wind power. So I knew that if I got on live television, they couldn't edit me out. So people need to be thinking about, how can they be spontaneous? How can they be visible? How can they be brave and courageous? I couldn't even speak Swedish. It was hilarious. If anyone watches the film, they might actually laugh at this scene. Then they need to actually speak to the people who are the decision makers, so that they start to get a feeling that that they're not above everyone else. So this is Ingmar Renshaug. He is credited with creating Greta. And of course, what happened to Greta? She was really big, and now suddenly she's gone. Ingmar Renshaug comes from Östersund. His brother is the founder of Soderbergh and Partners, one of the largest law firms in Sweden. They are together with Bob Persson and the Persson family. Kerstin Persson used to have a not-for-profit in Stockholm called global utmaning. It surprisingly influenced all of this green umstelling and all of the big celebrities and politicians, but went bankrupt and disappeared. So you're seeing lots of weird. So people need to find these people and speak to them. I interviewed him. I tried to figure out why he thinks the way that he thinks. And people need to do more of that. Then I went to see Greta and I interviewed Greta. I said, Greta, why do you think the way that you think? I speak to the right. I speak to the left. We spoke briefly about Aurora, this youth organization that's starting to ask questions about, does this make sense? More people need to be asking questions in a very public and visible and, recorded way. Jens Orbach, he's a C-list celebrity, very nice guy. He works for the Global Challenges Foundation, which is Laszlo. It's another one of these think tanks that has very strong influence. The Stockholm, the Högst Handelsskolan in Stockholm, the Harvard of Stockholm, strongly influenced by organizations like Global Challenges Foundation, the Wallenberg-Stiftelsen, etc. People need to start to say, well, why are these people so influential? And could it be that there is maybe some conflicts of interest? And then, of course, they need to be brave. So this is a scene from the film when I was trying to raise awareness about the wind power scandal, and I was taken by the police. Very graphic, very brutal. This was back in the times of COVID, so they were particularly brutal. But people just need to be brave. I was brave. I had some incredible experiences, met some incredible people, and those who want to be in the resistance, they just need to say that, I want to be part of something that when my children look back on what I did with my life, they saw that I stood up for myself. I did it with love, not violence and aggression, because, they want us to often, as happened to me there, I was picked up by the police for something that was not illegal. And then I was claimed to resist, even though I was just, I guess you would say, just trying to survive. And then they tried to charge me with a crime of violently resisting a public official. So people need to just be mindful that if you act with violence and aggression, you're putting yourself into the hands of the legal system that we live within. But if you do it with love and compassion and humanity, then chances are that you will come out very good. So I think the resistance needs to build up that way. Ask questions, challenge people in a positive and constructive way, be brave, and don't get drawn into fear, some of these binary discussions and arguments that cannot be won because it isn't binary, it's somewhere in the middle, and to enjoy yourself and have fun. I went through a valley of anger and depression, and now I've come out the other side, and I just thoroughly enjoy doing something that I feel is meaningful and purposeful, and that I think is going to end up creating good in the world rather than just contributing to the bad.
You mentioned when we spoke over the phone that you have been very inspired by a group of children actually raising critical questions. And they are, of course, the ones that will inherit this earth in the future. Can you tell us about that?
So that example, so as I said, I think the children are our future, as Michael Jackson once said. They are very critical because actually, if you think about it, they have the potential to change the DNA of society, because once they come through the ranks, it only takes 1 or 2 generations and you can completely change societies. This group is called Aurora. They're teenagers, maybe they're between 15 and 19. And they were at this Klimatseminariat in Stockholm, in Östersund, and they were starting to ask these paradox-type questions. Does it make sense to do the green transition that requires endless wind farms, mines, and endless massive industrial factories and data centers? Does that make sense? Open question. Clearly, the moderator was uncomfortable with it, but it does show that there are opportunities for these young people to really step up because they're smart. Everyone has a supercomputer between their ears. Most of us have switched it off. But once you start to switch your brain back on, and children are so, they're so imaginative, so creative, so in touch with nature, that if we can make sure that they don't lose that and get reprogrammed by these industrialists and these financiers and these people who really don't have our best interest at heart, if we can do that, then we'll end up being in a great position, because they will just carry it through with passion and compassion. And then hopefully we will be able to shut down this rise of the machines. I mean, it is literally like the opening scenes of the Terminator movie, where they're about to switch on Skynet. And we are early enough that we don't have to send a Terminator back from the future. We can actually do something ourselves and prevent this from ever happening.
Alexander, Pohl, great to have you. I want to thank you for being on the program.
Really appreciate it. And if any of your viewers have thoughts or feedback, by all means, I would love to hear it, because we also all need to be having a dialogue, because collectively we will come up with the solutions. If one man is an island, but if we all come together, we are an unstoppable army.
Great. And we'll link to your movie and whatever other links you want to recommend down below.
Thanks again. Really appreciate the time.